If you're watching, we're waiting for people to join the meeting room, so just bear with us for another minute or two. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. Hello, and welcome to our second information session on a proposed framework for a potential pan-Canadian formulary. My name is Heather Logan. I'm the Executive Strategy Lead, and I'm very pleased to be moderating today's webinar. We're joined by our co-chairs. This is our second webinar, so our co-chairs are back, Dr. Alexandra King and Mr. Alan Lefebvre, who will be sharing highlights today with you of the feedback we received and insights from the panel. Alexandra is an internal medicine specialist with a focus on HIV and AIDS, hepatitis C and HIV, and oft-related conditions. Alexandra is a member of the Nipissing First Nation in Ontario and the CAMCO chair in Indigenous Health and Wellness at the University of Saskatchewan. Alan has served in several management and volunteer leadership capacities, primarily in the charitable and not-for-profit sectors. Alan is a former public drug member of the CADTH Canadian Drug Expert Committee, also known as CDEC, and has been a public representative on the Drug Advisory Committee of Saskatchewan since 2010. Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which our Toronto offices, which is where I'm speaking to you from, operate. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and that is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. So you see in front of you the agenda for today. For this session, we'll be sharing some background and revisiting a summary of the advisory panel's work, including the stakeholder consultation process. And we'll provide a summary on who we heard from and what we heard during the stakeholder consultations. And when I say we, I am saying we, the panel. During the latter portion of the presentation, we will briefly report on the panel's process for discussing the feedback, so you understand how they went through that process and what the key topics were that were discussed at the panel's final set of meetings. Finally, we will conclude today's session by providing a snapshot of what you can expect next. We will do our best to provide time for questions, but I do want to flag ahead of time, we had an enormous response to the public consultation, and the panel really spent a lot of time, very considerate time, thinking through, walking through, and reviewing all of that feedback. And to do justice to the amount of feedback and what you shared with us, we're spending a lot of time today to go through that. So if we don't have time for questions, please know it's just out of respect for the time you spent sharing information with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our co-chair, Alan Lefebvre. Alan, over to you.
Thanks, Heather. Now I just need to get my notes back. All the virtual stuff. So we'll start by reviewing the work of a little bit of an overview of the advisory panel itself. I know this might be a bit of a refresher for those of you who were involved in back in earlier this year when we did issued the discussion paper and did a previous stakeholder engagement session, but it's worth reviewing this. So this panel was put together at the request, flip slides. This panel was put together at the request of Health Canada, and CADTH convened this group as a one-time sort of time-limited advisory panel. And our goal was to propose a framework for the Pan-Canadian Prescription Drug List, or the Pan-Canadian Formulary. There's a 14-member group, two of us who are co-chairs, Alexandra and I. You'll meet Alexandra in a minute, as well as 12 members. A very diverse group from across the country with a wide range of experience. I'm not going to go into everybody's background. There's a little bit of that on the bottom of this existing slide, but also all of this information is posted on the CADTH website if you wanted to look a little deeper. So how did we do our work? Well, 100% of it was virtual, not surprisingly, given the pandemic. We had a series of 5 panel meetings last year between July and September, which led to what we shared during the previous consultation back in January. Stakeholder engagement is a very key aspect of this work, and we wanted to model an approach that we expect the future Pan-Canadian Formulary to also pursue, and that includes today's session. The panel regrouped between March and May with an additional 3 meetings to review and to consider all of the stakeholder input. And that brings us to today, where we'll share what we heard and how we responded to that. I have to say this was a very dynamic and engaged group with a real passion for these issues. None were shy about sharing their perspectives, but everyone was always open-minded, respectful, and ready to challenge each other's thinking. It really, truly was a very good, a very invigorating panel to be involved in. So next slide. So for those of you who participated in the first webinar, or responded with the feedback, some of this stuff will look familiar to you. So the key aspects or the key asks of the things that we were requested from Health Canada were to develop the principles and the framework that could guide the Pan-Canadian Formulary, to create a proposed sample list of commonly prescribed drugs, and to build a test case on a subset of therapeutic areas. Establish criteria and transparent process that could expand the proposed sample list into all therapeutic areas, and then develop and conduct a stakeholder engagement process related to this. What wasn't included is on the right-hand side of the screen, what we called our out-of-scope items. So we did not assess current drug plan processes that exist right now, or how coverage on existing drug plans might be impacted by what we were creating. We didn't look at governance structures or funding decisions or any of the financing issues related to the formulary. We didn't look at what would define coverage in the future formulary. So in terms of patient eligibility or co-payments, those sorts of things. We also didn't look at the interplay between that exists right now between public and private insurance plans, or how they might be impacted by this. Nor did we include any other ongoing pharmaceutical initiatives, such as Health Canada's current the rare disease strategy that is currently being developed. And I know that these out-of-scope issues were a challenge. They were certainly a challenge for us as we wrapped our head around how to live within the box that we were provided. But I know, looking at all of the feedback that we received from you as part of that consultation process, a lot of you struggled with it as well in terms of how to make those decisions. But we know that building a national drug agency and a national formulary is complex, and our work both simultaneously informs and is impacted by these out-of-scope issues. And there's a lot of chicken and egg that has to happen here as these processes move forward. So although we were, I think, challenged and needed to work our way through that, we certainly understand the rationale for why it was done the way that it was done. So next slide. So the table in this slide will provide an overview of the proposed framework. It's a pretty complex and dense table, and I'll try and highlight a few things. So starting at the top, the goal, our overall goal to create a pan-Canadian formulary that includes a broad range of safe, effective, evidence-based drugs and related products that would be reflective of the healthcare needs of Canada's diverse population. That really was our guiding light. We then developed 6 guiding principles. And again, these are ones that you would have seen as part of the draft documents earlier in the year. There's really only one change to this from the ones that you saw before, and that was the addition of the word safe to the effective and high quality. There's more changes we'll talk about later, deeper into some of these, but in terms of the high level, those remain unchanged. We then are proposing 3 stages of work to actually build the formulary. The work that we've done is part of stage 1. The rest of stage 1 and the balance of 2 and 3 are all future work that need to be undertaken subsequent to the submission of our report from this work. And you'll see that we did create a proof of concept. We applied it to 3 therapeutic areas. Now, these therapeutic areas also caused, I think, some concern amongst people that we read in the feedback in terms of why these 3 and, did we prioritize these? And in fact, we chose these based on the volume of drugs involved, the volume of prescriptions, the disease prevalence, not because we felt they deserved some priority. We just felt they were a great test case for us to build and test our concept around. We truly want all therapeutic classes included, and that's really stage 2 in the future work. And so, and stage 3 is about adding new products as they come on board. So don't think of this as us making a choice as to the 3 that we want to see happen first. We picked some that were a good cross section that allowed us to do the work that we needed to do. You'll also see in the bottom box, we also have talked about some other key elements of the framework, continuing to use deliberative processes to evaluate products, developing formulary modernization strategies, and developing rules of procedural fairness. And I think it's important to recognize that this framework is only intended to provide a roadmap. Additional policies, procedures, and operational steps need to be developed and accompanied by broad stakeholder consultation all along. So there's lots of work yet to do. This is really the framework. This is, I think, the guiding principles that we want to create at the front that will help map out and hopefully guide the work that comes from here. So from here, I will turn it over to Alexandra, who will share more insights into what we heard from you.
Thanks, Alan. Hello, all. I would like to begin by thanking my co-chair, Alan Lefebvre, my colleagues on the panel, and the CADTH team. We've all worked really hard with good intentions and commitment to create something truly transformative. It has been an honor and a pleasure to serve as a co-chair. I'd also like to thank the many people and organizations who have engaged with us on this journey. The insights and wisdom you shared with us have been so appreciated. Because engagement with stakeholders is critical to this work, and with the support of CADTH, the panel consulted widely and worked diligently to ensure that a rich and comprehensive foundation of knowledge and perspectives were incorporated into our recommendations. Next slide, please. So stakeholder consultation included an online questionnaire, which was made available in English and French to solicit feedback on specific aspects of our work. This online consultation was held between January 11th, February 25th. In addition, an information session webinar was held on January 18th. As well, a focus group was held in late February to elicit the perspectives of people made vulnerable by social and/or economic policies, particularly those who have experienced historic and ongoing impacts of colonization. This innovative approach was used to better engage with this population whose voices are often not heard. It was felt this was especially important in developing a potential pan-Canadian formulary. As part of CADTH's commitment to its principles on transparency, all comments that were received by the consultation deadline will be publicly posted on the CADTH website. The entirety of the broad consultation will inform the final report. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the online consultation included a questionnaire, which along with a supporting discussion paper were posted to the CADTH website. The discussion paper summarized our interim recommendations and proposed process. The online questionnaire focused on the process for developing the proposed framework and consisted of 8 specific questions, as well as 1 open-ended question for additional comments. The key topic areas that we had asked about for input are indicated on the slide. Next slide, please. In total, we received 92 submissions through the online form, reflecting feedback from a wide range of perspectives, including patient groups, healthcare professionals, individuals from clinical societies, government and related agencies, associations, pharmaceutical companies, device companies, private insurance companies, researchers, and consultants. The pharmaceutical industry and patient groups represented a majority of the responses. 2 of the 21 patient group responses were on behalf of multiple organizations and represented a total of 22 patient organizations. The majority of responses were received from respondents in Ontario, largely due to the geographic location of the headquarters for industry, patient groups, clinical societies, and professional associations. 11 responses were from Quebec and 9 were received from respondents in BC. No responses were received from Newfoundland and Labrador, Prince Edward Island, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. Next slide, please. In terms of outreach efforts, we felt it was critical to hear and understand broad perspectives, particularly regarding prescription drug access and health equity. Through CADTH, the panel purposefully reached out to organizations who serve underrepresented groups and populations made vulnerable by social and/or economic policies to ensure diverse perspectives were heard and elicit deep and meaningful input from such groups. Invitations were issued to 15 organizations that serve communities at a national level and have a mandate or program that supports health-related initiatives, such as access to medication. Additionally, careful thought and efforts were made to invite representation from the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, and the Métis National Council. The invitations remain open, and CADTH is committed to engage respectfully and humbly with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, communities, organizations, and governments. Next slide, please. In terms of the focus group, the following 6 organizations participated in the focus group session in February. So the Canadian Centre for Substance Use and Addiction, Canadian Mental Health Association, Canadian Network for the Health and Housing of People Experiencing Homelessness, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, and Federation of Black Canadians. The session covered some key topics, including guiding principles, selecting drugs and related products for a potential pan-Canadian formulary, and approaches to or considerations for creating a potential pan-Canadian formulary. Next slide. So before we dive into summarizing what we heard, we would like to take this opportunity to again thank all individuals, groups, and organizations who participated in the public consultation period. We truly appreciate the thoughtful insights that were shared. I also want to briefly reflect on our engagement processes. To begin, I want to remind people that this occurred during COVID when many people, communities, organizations, and systems were overwhelmed. Many of those hit hardest by COVID, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, were who we wanted to especially hear from. CADTH undertook considerable efforts, including the innovative approach with a focus group. We recognize that we need more meaningful engagement with these communities and look forward to enhancing and accelerating our efforts. The responses we did receive were rich and comprehensive. There was often a range of responses of exemplifying the diversity amongst our stakeholders. Lastly, we want to highlight when we say respondents, we are referring to those who responded to the questionnaires, as well as those who participated in the focus group discussion and responded to questions within that session. In the time we have together today, we can only share a short summary of what we heard. As you can see on the slide, in addition to drafting guiding principles, we suggested a 3-stage approach to creating a pan-Canadian formulary. So stage 1, which is really where we're at now, is to select a small sample list of products as proof of concept for the process. Stage 2 is to review and revise the proposed list as appropriate, then apply the proposed criteria to other therapeutic areas in a subsequent future step to scale the process and expand the proposed list. Stage 3 involves recommending criteria and processes for adding new drugs and related products once all therapeutic areas have been considered, as well as strategies to maintain a proposed list over time. We will visit certain aspects of our work across all stages in the following slides to share what we heard through the stakeholder consultation. Next slide, please. So regarding the proposed principles and definitions, respondents were generally expressed agreement with the principles developed by the panel and noted that the principles would continue to improving and strengthening the principles under the Canada Health Act. Suggestions on how to refine definitions of principles were received. For example, consider inclusive and transparent public engagement, particularly with current and future users of the formulary, to ensure the process is patient-centered. Aligning diversity characteristics represented in the principles with the grounds under the Canadian Human Rights Act and other recognized health system principles. Factoring in and elaborating on how culturally appropriate access is embedded into the principles, specifically in terms of considerations made for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis health. Including differences in needs and level of access to drugs in rural and remote communities versus urban areas. There was also concern that medications are seen as a cost driver, Rather, there was suggestion to view them as an investment in the healthcare system to improve system efficiency. We received general comments inquiring about how the principles would be operationalized in practice, given the inherent tension between principles. Respondents recommended ensuring a clear, transparent, and accountable process. We were also requested to clarify our position around applying a population health perspective, as the definition of population health has evolved over time, and it is important to ensure that the needs of individuals are identified. Next slide, please. Creating a proposed sample list. So respondents generally agreed with the staged approach proposed by the panel. We received some specific suggestions, such as revisiting how the principles are reflected in the assessment criteria and whether any biases or gaps were inadvertently created by applying them to the sample list. Refining the criteria. For example, consider drawing from other sources of information beyond listing status to make decisions. This could include guidelines as well as patient registries. Providing additional clarity on the panel's recommendations on over-the-counter drugs, combination products, flagged products, and issues related to drug shortages. Alternative approaches for creating a sample list were suggested, such as building separate lists solely for over-the-counter or low utilization drugs, or following an essential medicines list model. Other suggestions included that the assessment criteria should be flexible enough to meet the needs of all populations and ensure populations made vulnerable by social and/or economic policies are not further disadvantaged. Some thought that this work would be an opportunity to ensure that no additional gaps in access to drugs are created, including continuity of care where patients are moved from one payer to another. So for example, hospital to community, public to private plans, or vice versa. There was also general support for prioritizing the use of biosimilars and generics. Some did not agree with substitution policies, however. Next slide. In general, respondents agreed with the proposed definition and eligibility criteria to determine which related products should be listed. However, there were some respondents who disagreed entirely with the current definition and advocated for broader consultation first. We also received some specific examples of potential and related products that could be included, and it was noted that the overall value of a related product could extend beyond simply improving adherence. Importantly, we received suggestions on how to refine the definition and received mixed reviews that supported both a more restricted definition as well as a broadened definition. So for restricted definition, it was suggested to only include related products that provide optimal use of specific medications for optimal response and when their use is evidence-based. Broader definitions suggested to include products and/or other services that, in addition to ensuring optimal treatment benefits, are essential for a patient to either initiate treatment or to continue to receive a treatment. Examples include supplies necessary for dose adjustments or safe product administration, such as insulin pens with memory, diagnostic tests to determine appropriate drug choices, for example, pharmacogenomic testing, and digital health technology or technologies or services provided by nurses and pharmacists as part of drug administration and monitoring. The broadest definition suggestions include non-drug products that are essential to manage daily life or devices that provide symptomatic relief, or non-drug products used to maintain health, address stigma, or avoid exacerbating the medical condition, particularly in populations who may face challenges with access to basic products. Such examples would include wound care supplies, moisturizers, and supplements. In terms of related criteria and eligibility to determine criteria to determine eligibility for assessment, there was a general agreement to establish clear eligibility criteria to identify which related products could be assessed for inclusion on a pan-Canadian formulary. And some respondents suggested exploring established criteria used by provincial, territorial public drug benefit programs or other existing guidelines or policy statements. Next slide, please. In creating a proposed sample list, related products inclusion on drug list and evaluation criteria. So respondents generally agreed that related products should be listed on the proposed pan-Canadian formulary, as this will streamline processes for patients, caregivers, and healthcare providers and provide a simplified point of access. Some noted that related products may not have the same level of high quality evidence and may not go through similar regulatory rigor for safety and efficacy as drug products. In terms of evaluating related products, reasons were shared both for and against using the same evaluation criteria as drugs. So given that related products are integral to the optimal use of the drug and work in tandem to achieve intended health outcomes, similar evaluation standards could ensure timeliness and alignment of therapeutic use for both drugs and related products. However, challenges in applying the same criteria for different types of evidence were noted, and some respondents suggested including further supporting evidence. An entirely different set of criteria approach for related products was also suggested. For example, automatically included related products once a drug is included in a formulary. Next slide, please. In terms of expanding to other therapeutic areas, there was general agreement that the sample list should be expanded to other therapeutic areas using the same proposed criteria. However, the majority of respondents expressed that out-of-scope issues should be addressed in a thoughtful and meaningful way, either in parallel or prior to proceeding with expansion. We received several suggestions on how to identify which therapeutic areas to expand into next. For example, broad consultations should be held to identify the needs of patients and to understand the experiences and complexities of their health service requirements. There were also suggestions for conducting an impact analysis prior to expansion to identify the gaps being filled and ensure that the needs of the patients are being met. Several comments on our work were also received. For example, there were mixed views on including specialized drug programs, such as cancer drugs, and some pointed out the challenges in implementing the complex and individualized treatment algorithms required by these patient populations. Some respondents supported prioritizing remaining therapeutic areas based on national health priorities, but noted it cannot be overly political and should be nimble. Other respondents did not support the approach to prioritize based on national health priorities, but rather noted that priorities may vary by factors such as region, ethnicities, socio-demographic, and socio-cultural factors. Others suggested against prioritizing altogether and instead encouraged that a full formulary be developed prior to implementation. Next slide, please. In terms of adding to and maintaining a potential pan-Canadian formulary, and specifically the process for initiating review of new products, we originally presented 3 potential options on how reviews of new drugs and indications could be initiated. Option 1 involves a prioritization model aligned with Health Canada's priority reviews. Option 2 involves a clear and transparent scoring system that would prioritize certain new medication submissions. For example, new innovative products that address unmet needs of a population. Option 3 involves working together at an international level to review and prioritize products collectively. There was no agreement on any one option as an alternative to a first in, first out submission review process. Mixed reviews were received on maintaining a first in, first out approach. Several respondents felt that a first in, first out approach is optimal as it was thought to be the most predictable, transparent, fair, and logistically feasible. However, other respondents noted that a first in, first out process does not consider factors such as unmet patient needs and does not consider that not all drugs offer substantial health outcomes. Also, mixed views were received on alternatives to a first in, first out approach, as oftentimes respondents noted that more information and context, particularly on out of scope areas, is needed before selecting an option. Despite this, we received suggestions at other potential ways to approach the submission review initiation process. For example, several respondents suggested a combination of approaches could be considered. One such way would be a hybrid approach, which combines a model to align with Health Canada's priority reviews with a scoring system to prioritize new drug submissions, which could result in an equitable and efficient review process. Others suggested entirely different approaches. For example, existing processes and harmonizing currently used methods rather than adding new elements. Exploring processes used by other countries was also suggested. As well, we heard that the opportunity to share best practices should be optimized. For example, international collaboration would reduce duplication of effort, allow sharing of best practices, and possibly accelerate adoption of real-world evidence into healthcare technology assessment reviews. But this may be more suitable as a very long-term plan. Next slide, please. So in terms of adding new products to potential pan-Canadian formulary, we recommended 6 main criteria for use when evaluating new drugs. The respondents generally agreed or agreed in part with the proposed evaluation criteria for new products. We received several requests. For example, to refine the proposed evaluation criteria, such as redefining clinical benefit and taking a comprehensive societal or broad system level view. There were suggestions to ensure that criteria can accommodate for future advancements in evidence generation methods and reimbursement mechanisms in order to ensure timely access to medical innovations. For example, outcomes-based or other innovative funding agreements, real-world evidence development, and data sharing across all stakeholder platforms. The panel was asked to consider how effectively the principles will be applied when making decisions based on the evaluation criteria and how well they will remain patient-centered. Respondents had mixed views on which criteria should be prioritized, indicating the potential for tension between the application of these criteria. Respondents also noted the importance of ensuring clear accountability for processes and definitions. Next slide, please. In terms of deliberative process, only half of the respondents of the online questionnaire answered this question. Among them, there was some agreement that the deliberative process should include weighting of the evidence, for example, by using decision-making tools such as a multi-criteria decision analysis, or MCDA. Several respondents felt that an MCDA process could reduce the subjectivity of a qualitative decision-making process. However, it was recommended that scoring systems should be created by those experienced in decision analysis, and that the methodology and weighting should be transparent and based on robust methods through broad consultation. A small number of respondents did not explicitly agree with incorporating an MCDA in decision-making process. A scoring system could be used as a starting point, but some respondents felt that an emphasis should be on a values-based discussion approach rather than only on numeric scoring. Mixed views were received on which criteria should be prioritized or given greater weight, than others, and there were frequent suggestions where clinical effectiveness, safety, patient centricity, and patient perspectives. Respondents recommended flexibility in the process to account for the specific needs of different therapeutic areas and noted that a rigid decision-making process that does not incorporate multiple perspectives and disciplines could create or exacerbate inequities. Others emphasize the need to adapt existing drug review processes to reduce duplication of effort while giving due consideration to the current gaps in the processes. In particular, we receive feedback that there is a need to reconcile the patchwork of separate federal, provincial, and territorial formularies and their respective priorities in order to address silos. Next slide, please. In terms of formulary modernization, respondents were generally in favor of a timely and ongoing formulary modernization process, while many recognized that it would be resource intensive. Some felt that immediate priority should be on the creation of a pan-Canadian formulary and that identifying new process for formulary modernization and maintenance should be addressed after a pan-Canadian formulary is in place. We also received suggestions on strengthening processes. For example, ensuring that any prioritization process should be transparent and collaborative. Processes are flexible for different categories of therapies and provide room for potentially expediting reassessment for certain drugs. And current formulary modernization initiatives, both international and within Canada, are leveraged. In terms of general comments, there were mixed reviews received on the frequency of reassessments. Some agreed with regular preset cycles for review, including having this as a condition for funding in certain circumstances to support accelerated patient access to therapies that show promising benefits. Alternatively, others suggested developing a criteria to trigger reassessments. For example, when there is new evidence or developing a scoring system to prioritize a drug for reassessment. Next slide, please. In terms of additional comments, respondents felt that establishing details of important areas deemed out of scope are a prerequisite to providing meaningful feedback. As such, many of the comments received were on topics beyond the scope of this panel's work. In particular, many respondents sought for more detailed information on the drug plan and program design. Respondents noted that the following should be considered when designing a potential pan-Canadian formulary. The need for more effective and integrated data systems in Canada, inclusion of hospital formularies, building the system around the most vulnerable, that is, who is not filling their prescriptions because they cannot afford or access their medications. Ensuring meaningful and early engagement with all parties throughout each step of the process. More emphasis should be placed on preventative health measures as well as allied health and adjunct therapies. There were mixed reviews on whether drugs for all areas, including rare diseases or cancer, should proceed through the same process. A few respondents stated that a strategy for rare diseases needs to be considered as part of the discussion of a potential pan-Canadian formulary due to overlapping issues and challenges faced by these patients. Conversely, some respondents recommended that drugs for oncology and rare diseases be excluded from the potential pan-Canadian formulary because these are specialized medications that require tailored approaches and expert clinical reviewers to help develop appropriate reimbursement recommendations. Several respondents provided suggestions on how a pan-Canadian formulary could be shaped and alternatives to the current system. For example, addressing current coverage gaps, considering a mix of public and private systems, or conversely, a fully public system. Overall, the feedback demonstrated agreement on the fundamental need to improve medication access for patients. Respondents recognized the limitations and challenges with the current infrastructure, complex funding arrangements, and multitude of drug programs available across the country. The creation of a pan-Canadian formulary could provide an opportunity to strengthen collaboration among all key entities and partners to improve the drug reimbursement ecosystem in Canada. So at this point, I would like to turn it back over to Alan, and if we can go to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Alexandra. So as I'm sure you can appreciate, with 92 submissions, that summary Alexandra provided was a pretty high level summary, and I certainly encourage everybody to, actually all of those submissions are now posted on the CADTH website, so you're welcome to look at those. So what did we do with that information? That's really what I want to touch on now. So this will be a bit of a quick overview on the process that we used, and I want to then follow that with a highlight of a few of the key topics that from our perspective were influenced by your input. And again, same as similar to Alexandra, this summary is it really is a very short summary of the full content. So next slide, please. So start with, I think it's, I wanted to point out that really the panel felt it was paramount to consider all of your feedback, and that making sure that, it was given proper due diligence, and that, ensure that the voices of everyone who participated, that took the time. I mean, what you wrote was a lot of very comprehensive and very thoughtful comments, and we wanted to make sure we considered them fully. Bit of a daunting task given the volume of that, but what a great challenge to have. So the feedback was framed by 8 questions, 3 of which had 2 parts. So there were 11 themes in total. The CADTH staff did a wonderful job of parsing that full content into the 11 themes, and then synthesized those into a series of questions for the panel for us to explore collectively. We then worked in pairs where we broke down each of those themes and we explored them in great detail, dipping back and forth into your full submissions as well as we needed to understand them in their full context. Those pairs of panel members then formulated recommendations and led the overall group discussion on each item, identifying how the panel's work could be enhanced by the feedback that we received from you. Those pairs of people and those themes, I think, drew heavily on the specific expertise and expertise of the panel members that they brought to the table. When we encountered out of scope topics, which Alexandra mentioned, we highlighted those and they helped to inform and identify the section of our report that deals with the future work that we mapped out. And you'll see that when the report becomes available. All of our decisions based on your feedback are in the process right now of being incorporated into that final report. This is probably more detail than you needed at this point, but we wanted to make sure that you knew that your voices were heard, that your input certainly influenced the final outcome, and we worked very hard to ensure that we digested these and reviewed them in great detail. Next slide, please. So these next slides are the summary of some of the key topics that we discussed when we reviewed the feedback. To start, we changed our wording to reflect the formulary as an important investment that will improve the quality of life for all people living in Canada, rather than a cost burden, rather than just a cost burden that needs to be managed. And I think that really was language that came to us very clearly through a few of your submissions. We also emphasized that access to medications is only one part of a necessary healthcare system, and that design for such a formulary should be aligned with, if not completely integrated into, other elements of the healthcare system. It's not something that needs to be considered in isolation. The proper and adequate use of pharmaceuticals is an integral part of a well-functioning healthcare system, and that's how we need to look at this as we're going forward. Thinking broadly in terms of commitments, we believe that first and foremost, the people of Canada are all equally deserving of having their healthcare needs. And this means being mindful of what determines the health of a population, as well as the need to reduce inequities within that population, specifically looking at patterns of need and access and rectifying unfair distribution. To create a framework to achieve this goal, we built on 3 underpinning concepts. 1, first and foremost, it must be patient-oriented. Secondly, it must involve meaningful and thoughtful multi-stakeholder consultation at every level, and you'll hear me repeat that a few times as we go through this. And thirdly, that there must be transparency of process. People need to understand how and why decisions are being made and by who. In our minds, multi-stakeholder consultation must include patients who should be participants in each and every step of the process framework, as well as clinicians, their representatives, and as well as the citizens who will be affected by the resource allocation decisions that are made. We are committed to engaging with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people as partners in this system and are open to dialogue with the aim to engage and learn from our Indigenous communities on how we can best support Indigenous health and wellness. We've made some baby steps in this regard, but much more needs to be done. Next slide. Based on the feedback, we need to clarify the purpose of and the interplay between the 6 principles. These are meant to be interpreted as guideposts and are not listed in any particular order. They're not prioritized. We recognize that the principles reflect commitments that will at times be in tension, and to balance commitments to individual patients and subgroups of populations. We recommend that a more systematic analysis is performed on how the formulary interprets and balances these different commitments over time. The use of concrete tools where possible could also be used to determine how the principles could be interpreted, weighed, and balanced. We also feel the principles of the Pan-Canadian Formulary should align with, but remain independent from the principles followed by other initiatives or organizations in the Canadian healthcare system. This will avoid any ripple effects if those principles change, if those other principles change in the future. Next slide. So in terms of revisiting the approach taken to create the sample list of drugs, we explored several options to create the sample list, including the essential medicines list approach. We concluded that the current approach is the most pragmatic. It's in alignment with our proposed principles and the most comprehensive within each therapeutic area. Cost effectiveness is an important contributor to fiscal sustainability and an essential part of the process for ultimately determining what is included or not included. Due to the time and resource constraints of this panel, we did not conduct cost-effective analysis for each product in the sample list, but we do recommend that it be conducted in the future as part of the next steps, excuse me, in the refinement processes of this list. We strongly advocate that patient diversity as well as patient perspectives, experiences, and outcomes should be included as a fundamental aspect of this assessment process. Next slide. So related products, and I noticed that there was already a question in the chat box about this. So we agree with many respondents that related products should be included in this formulary, something that's incidentally not included in any of the EML or those other WHO and FDA lists. We believe that the definition of related products should not be prescriptive, but based on a set of criteria. Our definition of what related products should be that we're proposing is devices that directly support the delivery, administration, and optimal use of those drugs that are listed to assist in the safe use of a drug or dose management tools to improve patient care. The process to identify which related products are eligible for inclusion in the potential formulary should replicate the process followed for drug products. In other words, they should go through a deliberative review process. While we believe that the eligibility criteria should remain flexible, in the initial stages, it should also remain conservative to allow appropriate testing and evaluation of the criteria. All of the evaluation criteria used to evaluate new drugs should apply to the evaluation of related products as well. However, given the nature of the product, drug versus device, and the variable availability of evidence, adaptation or modification of the evaluation criteria may be required. Next slide. So in terms of expansion into other therapeutic areas, or stage 2 of our proposal, again, patient-oriented and meaningful engagement with diverse stakeholders and experts should guide the expansion to a comprehensive formulary. We do not favor the prioritizing of one therapeutic area over another. We recommend that all therapeutic areas will be reviewed for potential inclusion prior to implementation. An expeditious finalization of a potential Pan-Canadian formulary across all therapeutic areas simultaneously is preferable. In order to expand to other therapeutic areas in a meaningful way, we also agreed that it's preferable for the out-of-scope issues to be addressed either in parallel or prior to conducting this further work. Next slide. So the first in, first out submission process, I know Alexandra talked a bit about this in terms of your feedback. The feedback we received included both sides of the pros and cons of the first in, first out process. After completing a thorough analysis of the impact of the current processes, we're recommending the implementation of a hybrid model, basically two pathways. The first is the standardized first-in process that we're familiar with now, which will probably apply to most drugs, but also implementing a fast-track priority review process for select drugs that address an unmet need or have exceptional benefits. This will result in a fair and predictable submission review process, but also allows priority drugs to become available more quickly. A multifactorial prioritization process is intended here, with criteria that include patient input and equitable access considerations as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of elaborating on the criteria for evaluating new drugs and indications, we recognize that the need to find innovative ways to strengthen clinical trial evidence and meaningfully incorporate patient perspectives and experiences. We expect a commitment to rigorous, high-quality, real-world post-market data collection and appraisal is needed. At the same time, we also recognize that healthcare providers with their expertise, knowledge, and experience treating multiple patients also have a key role. So we need to find ways to better incorporate those data sets into future reviews. For each stage of the process for selecting drugs for the formulary, we'll be proposing criteria that are linked to the 6 guiding principles. Like the principles, these evaluations are not prioritized. These evaluation criteria, are not prioritized. We also want to emphasize that the financial feasibility of adoption of a drug is also crucial to consider to meet the long-term goals of a formulary and align with the principles of being sustainable. We believe that a holistic approach to making deliberative processes transparent and fair should give consideration to both conceptual and operational aspects. In other words, the principles and the processes involved. We asked respondents about the potential role of a multi-criteria decision analysis, or MCDA, that Alexandra mentioned, to support objective decision-making, and we believe that it should be considered within the deliberative framework. However, this is a significant shift away from what most current drug review processes are in Canada, and could have other unintended impacts on the system that we think need to be further explored before adopting this approach. We also strongly agree that a deliberative framework should not create or exacerbate inequities or continue to support, continue to support the patient centricity that we have recommended. Next slide. Formulary modernization is crucial for constantly aligning the formulary within, I think we've...
we just need to go back one slide, please.
Back one, I think. Yep, 32. Formulary modernization is crucial for constantly aligning the formulary within current evidence. However, we recognize this is a resource-intensive process, and judicious resource allocation along with prioritization criteria will be required to address this. Again, this process should be transparent and take a collective approach to meaningfully engage patients and all partners in the healthcare system. We again encourage exploring and increasing the role of real-world data to support the prioritization of drugs for this reassessment, as well prioritizing which drugs should be reassessed, as well as in the reassessment itself. And in terms of the last but not least, the out-of-scope messages already mentioned by Alexandra, a number of out-of-scope issues were raised by respondents, which should be considered as part of our future work. These will be identified in a report in a section specifically dealing with future work. Early and continued engagement will be required to refine the details of creating and maintaining the Pan-Canadian formulary, and this should continue as the out-of-scope items are addressed. So next steps, what's going to happen from here? Now we can move to the next slide. So I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the work of all the collaborative efforts of all the members of this panel, and want to thank them again for their passion and commitment to the work that we've done. It's really been a pleasure to work with Alexandra and all the panel members on this. Actually, the next slide, please. To encourage the conversation on these topics and enhance transparency, we will be publishing, and all of this, actually they have been published now, all of the submissions that we've received, as well as a summary of the focus group discussion we had back in January as well. Your input informs the final report, and that will be submitted to Health Canada, and this will be shared with all provincial and territorial governments and made publicly available as well early in the summer. Most importantly, we'd like to thank all of you, the respondents who have taken the time to submit feedback through the online questionnaire or participated in the focus group. Your input was thoughtful and well-reasoned and very helpful and very much appreciated. So with this, I'll turn it back over to Heather.
Thank you so much, Alan and Alexandra. I will say it is an honor for all of us at CADTH to have had the opportunity to work with you as co-chairs and with the panel. Given the time, I think we've got a volume of questions that have come in, including offers of people who would like to step up and help and give an extra voice. So it's clear this is a topic and an issue that's important to a lot of people. First question I'm going to pose to you, Alexandra, and then I'll come to you, Alan. So the first question, you talked about equity, about different populations, about addressing variability. We've had lots of comments in the chat function about that. And in particular, in terms of being equitable and supporting a distinctions-based approach that promotes self-determination. Is this something you can speak a little bit more to?
Thanks, Heather. We had been having a conversation about equity and the importance of it. And I think having had COVID impact us all in such an incredible way, but particularly those who are really struggling with social and economic issues, brought equity to the forefront for the panel. So a potential pan-Canadian formulary should contribute to equal opportunities for health and wellness for people living in Canada, with the desired results that would lead to equal outcomes. An equitable pan-Canadian formulary would lead to equal, that would lead to drugs being available for people living in Canada in a way to make prescription drugs and related products more accessible to all who currently do not have access. We really need to counteract barriers to access. So a pan-Canadian formulary should be equitable and support a distinctions-based approach that promotes self-determination.
Thank you very much. Alan, so I know we only have 2 minutes left for you to answer a question that could take a half a day to answer, but I reflect on the panel's starting process of what did they use as a base and what did they consider and learn from as the panel moved forward with the proposed approach that it's really putting forward today and put forward in the consultation, in particular, the essential medicines list. Can you talk a little bit about how the panel thought about this and did it move down that path and why, if it didn't move down that path, can you explain a little bit to the audience about why?
Well, we explored that path for sure. And this is a long answer, or I'll try to not make a long answer, but there will be an appendix in our report that deals with this. And so there will be more detail, but we'll essentially look at the WHO model, the FDA model, the Clean Meds list are all much more restrictive lists than what we have. We actually fundamentally didn't think they fit within our principles. Things like, the devices were not included in any of them. They're a much more limited list. The list that we've generated, the way we've looked at it and the criteria we've used has actually developed a more comprehensive list. And when our panel looked at the implications of reducing the list and what that would mean to patients who may be forced to transition to different drugs because they're currently on something that isn't on the new list, all those kinds of issues in terms of equity and all of our principles, they just didn't fit. We felt we needed to be broader than the way those essential medicines list those other ones are currently constructed. They also had very different reasons for the way they were built, and you need to look at what those reasons are to understand why there's differences between what they've done and what we've done. Thank
you. Thank you very much. So on behalf of CADTH, and I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us today, those of you who've provided feedback to our panel, our co-chairs. We truly appreciate you spending time with us today. Stay tuned. The panel's report will be published early summer this year, so coming very soon. And we, again, thank you for your time today. Have a good day.